Mark Stavish, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. And you are the Director of Studies for the Institute of Hermetic Studies, and you're also an author of numerous books on alchemy and magic and related subjects. So perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Well, as you said, my name is Mark Stavish. I'm the Director of Studies for the Institute for Hermetic Studies, which started or grew out of a group that I was running in the late 1990s, in 1998. And I have extensive experience in a lot of modern esoteric movements, particularly Amor, various Martinist groups, but also the Philosophers of Nature, which formulated a great deal of my philosophical and practical view about alchemy and Kabbalah. I also grew up in a family that was deeply rooted in traditional esoteric studies, going back to Europe, and with that have some connection to what we often call as Pennsylvania German folk magic, or powwow or polka.
Yeah.
But really that falls under the domain of kind of a folkish Nordic Hermeticism, if you will, deeply rooted in the writings of Agrippa, but also there's philosophical aspects of Bhima and others there as well. So that's myself.
Okay, very good. I've heard a little bit about the Pennsylvanian Dutch, but it's not something I'm entirely familiar with, but I'm certainly familiar with those different streams of Western esoteric thought. But so today we're going to look at Western esotericism and practices and theories and how they relate to each other, and how esotericism relates to the general culture. So perhaps you could just begin by giving us some thoughts on how esotericism relates to the culture or doesn't relate to the culture, maybe today and in the past.
Well, esotericism, as you know, really means inner. So it's always an inner practice.
Right.
One of the problems that we have is, how do we preserve an inner practice in a framework that it can be transmitted from generation to generation? And generally that means through writing it down. Now, if you live in a time and a place where there is material support for that, and we'll say such as during the classical period, or even during the what we would think of as the medieval period or the Renaissance period here, but in Asia, okay, so you see in places like Tibet and India and China, where there was a variety of supports for this, either through individuals or communities, or just through taxation. Most people don't understand it. Most of these great monasteries and centers of learning were supported off the public purse.
Right.
But there you have a support for it. So there you have both symbolism, you have an oral tradition and a written tradition, and it's fairly widely known. You know where to go to get these practices if you want them, okay? Whereas at the same time in Western Europe and in the Mediterranean area, they existed more or less underground, because you just didn't know from ruler to ruler, district to district, country to country, how favorable it might be looked upon. Okay? So esotericism becomes occulted or hidden. And these two are often confused. Okay?
Yeah.
So just because it's inner doesn't necessarily mean it's hidden from public view. But what we've done is we have taken it and not only hidden it from public view for its own safety, okay, but in doing so, have also then clouded it over extensively in a lot of symbolism that has maybe unique meanings to individuals or groups or times and places that we have trouble then understanding several generations later, or maybe even several centuries later. Those listeners familiar with, Tibetan Buddhism and may know that, Dzogchen within the teachings of Lubun and within Nyingma is considered the ninth jhana, the highest teaching, and all of this ninth vehicle. Well, take a very close look at that, and you'll see there's very little difference between most Dzogchen teachings and, say, the psycho-cybernetics of Max Schmaltz, okay? Very little. It's about understanding one's own mind. It's just about how do we go about doing that, and then what is the broader framework that we go about doing that in. That broader framework being both cultural, but also, we'll say, cosmological. These things deeply affect how information that we call esoteric, or knowledge, inner teachings that lead to an inner awareness, a self-awareness, how they then get presented to the public and how they get passed on from generation to generation.
Yeah, indeed. And so, how do you feel? I mean, today, for example, it seems like spirituality and sort of what used to be called New Age spirituality is very much in vogue, and everybody, practices yoga in the cities and this kind of thing. It's extremely popular, and even things like people like Aleister Crowley, I don't think would be especially taboo anymore. There was an exhibition of Crowley's art and other people's art in the occult in New York a few months back. And so it does seem to be accessible. So how do you think that relates, the culture, to esotericism? Are we gaining something or losing something by this?
Well, it's always a mixed bag. And let me go back to, again, I think Tibet is a good example because, we so idealized it. Tibet was one of those places where you really had the first introduction of think of as tantric teachings on a widespread scale, across culture. And even though there are varying levels of tantric teachings, the fact is everybody was vaguely familiar with at least something because it was so common.
Right, yeah.
Now, that said, this still was not a nation of adepts in the sense that we like to think of. We have a very idealized view of it, which is unfortunate. It does an injustice to them, but more importantly, it does an injustice to ourselves.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Within the same framework today, it's very good that people have access to information where they can improve the quality of their mind and thereby improve the quality of their life. So this is all very good. However, often what we find is that these things are in bits and pieces, often taken out of context, and therefore it is kind of like, how could I say, an individual does not sit down to this wonderful 5, 6, or 7 course meal created and served by a world-class chef, or even somebody's grandmother who is just the most best cook there is in the neighborhood. Instead, what they're doing is they're sitting down to a buffet, if you will, and gorging themselves on the food they like the most, but not which will necessarily be the most nutritionally balanced.
Yeah, absolutely.
What we're missing is a kind of nutritional spiritual balance, if you will.
Right, exactly, very much so. And obviously people tend to go to things that is sort of akin to their personality, so they end up becoming even more sort of overly balanced on one side, right? So,
well, as you mentioned before we began this interview, and as I've talked about in some of my writing, is a retreat into the domain of the mind.
Right, exactly.
And not even the mind as it is, but a retreat into an intellect and a constructed fantasy.
Yeah.
And we see more and more of that. And what this creates is a lot of excuse making, a lot of ideas, a lot of righteous indignation, a lot of moralizing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the people who do that are setting themselves up for not only profound mental illness, but particularly a tremendous shock that will go with that when they make contact with reality.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and this tends to be, from what I've seen, especially where people become involved with or adopt political positions and then try and drag politics into their spiritual practice, so that whatever is the latest moral fashion is what they believe spirituality and spiritual traditions have always taught, when obviously that's not the case at all. And obviously there's a lot of sort of ideology based around excuses today where we shouldn't try and improve ourselves because that would be hateful, and we should just love everybody for the way they are, even though just being the way you are may be incredibly unhealthy, and certainly in a lot of cases it is.
Well, this is what we see. I mean, spirituality has nothing to do with politics, although there's a certain implication politically. That's why esoteric teachings have always been suppressed and oppressed by totalitarian regimes, particularly in recent history in Europe, National
Yeah.
Socialism, and also the communist regime. And that is
Right.
probably most fantastic is within the West, and that means Western Europe, as well as the United States and Canada, Australia. We see a tremendous amount of excuse making for the horrors of the Soviet regime
Yeah.
and what it did to esotericism. Um, so within that framework, that excuse making and that failure to grasp reality is really just a way of it is the occult equivalent. It is the modern occult equivalent of what you see in the churches. People fundamentally left the churches because they were no longer being taught a method. They were being
Right.
taught a sense of do's and don'ts, some modestly effective morality, more or less,
Yeah.
and ethics. But when that became the only thing, and you saw a complete movement of the churches into this less rigorous social justice platform, attendance collapsed. So what happens is now within the neo-pagan movement and the magical movement in the West and Tibetan Buddhism in the West, and Buddhism as a whole in the West, it's really just little more than a political action committee for left-wing politics.
Right.
And that's why it will collapse
Mm.
because it has no internal read. It's just a means. Again, it's another external means. So the individual doesn't have to do anything to change themselves. They just have to have the right faith or the right belief and the right view and all the right fill in the whatever you want it to be. But it has nothing to do with my understanding my own mind, my understanding my own emotions, my creating a vision of myself and what I want it to be, and then working towards that. Whereas self improvement, self realization is also self actualization.
Right.
Realization is passive. Actualization is active.
Yeah.
Once I realize an aspect of myself, I then act upon it and bring it into fruition in this azeia, the world of action. And that comes from within to without and has nothing to do with a preferred political bias or perception. In fact, if anything, you would see that the majority of occultists, spiritual people who've achieved anything of level tend to be what we would call in modern terms very libertarian.
Right. Yeah. 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 I think in some respects, Crowley was also sort of a libertarian-ish, anyway, sort of leaning, we'll say.
Yeah, and I just throw that out there to try and give it context. I don't even like doing that, because I don't want to put that label on there and people think that. But the one thing it isn't is it isn't definitively left of center.
Right.
It
No.
doesn't mean that because you're an occultist you must embrace political correctness. In fact, political correctness is a satanic notion, and I say that in the
Yeah.
in the esoteric meaning of the word. It is
Yeah.
counter-initiatic.
Right. Well, you probably saw my statement the other day about politics being satanic as well. So.
Well, I saw the statement, but I didn't get a chance to read it yet. It was on my
Okay.
list. But what we mean by that, for listeners who don't understand, Satan means both opposition. You
Yeah.
know, that is the opposition that we have to run against, but also in that other sense of a downward push
Yeah.
of involution, an involutionary element. Um, the notion of political correctness is such that it is always about constraint. It's ironic because the notion is about it says it's about liberty and freedom, but it's really not. It's about
Yeah.
constraint.
Yeah. That's
So
right.
the more and more you control people, the less self-actualized they can become.
Yeah, and I think as well, not to go on about political correctness too much, but it not only is it constrained, but I mean, as you say, it's constrained in the form of presenting itself as sort of liberty. But things like that we have to say that people who are obese are perfectly wonderful as they are, and I would never shame someone for being overweight or even obese, but I would want to encourage someone to be as healthy as possible because there are all kinds of illnesses and
Correct.
life-threatening illnesses that can come from that. And for me, the esoteric and the occult and so on and so forth has always been about transcendence and sort of uplifting oneself. And then for me that, and I think, historically as well, that has to mean taking responsibility for the body you were given. It's not a toy. It's a real thing that needs to be nourished and improved in a certain way, such as alchemy. The idea of making gold, whether that's literal or figurative. There's a certain process that nature has given, and you can't just say I'm happy with the dross, really, if you want to be an alchemist.
Well, that's the problem that we run into. Is there's a certain, and this is the downside, when it's too easy to get, then people just don't give enough value. There's a tremendous amount of effort and sacrifice that goes into making this stuff available. I mean, there's a very strong possibility, for those who read my article on thoughts on the age of Aquarius, I mean, there's a very strong possibility that history is going to look back on this time frame, a period from roughly 75 to 1975, 1980, 85 to about 2010, 2015, as being the golden age of occultism. And because there's a very, very good chance, or esotericism, I should say, because there's a very good chance that this will return to occultism and become hidden and go underground again. That's a very strong possibility, and that is not being understood. And one of the reasons is because there is not enough sacrifice.
Yeah, absolutely.
By those who claim to be practitioners, by those who claim to even be upholding the mantle. There's a lot of problems. I mean, we can solve them. I've addressed them in a lot of articles, and there are people who are working to solve them. But just for the general listener, for the general audience to understand maybe the context that they're not used to hearing, effort, constant personal effort and vigilance is what is required to become an adept. And that doesn't mean being neurotic about your problems. Often they will resolve themselves. But again, as you've stated, if you're chronically obese and you can do something about it, you have an obligation to do the best for yourself that you can. And that's in all areas of your life. You have an obligation to do the best for yourself that you can, because then you can do the best for others. You can only help others to the degree that you can help yourself. You must be a living role model for others. You must inspire them through your actions, not your words, not how you vote so that you take someone else's money to support your cause, but through what you do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, actually, there's an Islamic hadith or saying of the Prophet Muhammad where he says that you were made to be praying all night, but then he says, but don't do that. You should be like sleeping and eating properly, and your body has a right over you. And it seems that's completely obvious, right? But it's being completely lost in the occult world, and just in the modern world in general. We feel we have a right to be unhealthy, and you do have a right to be unhealthy, but really occultism and initiation is not about what rights you have, but what obligations you have. Everybody has rights, but people who want to transcend or uplift themselves should be focusing on what obligations do they have. And we have obligations to our mind and to our spiritual being and even to our body. So,
well, even the notion of rights, that's a conventional, mundane notion,
right?
And I support it within a modest reason, because it's helpful for getting people to. It's helpful for getting people to get along with each other.
Yeah,
but as a esotericist, I recognize that I have no rights.
Right.
I have only duties and obligations.
Exactly. Yeah, and of course with something like Freemasonry, you swear an obligation. You don't swear to enjoy your rights. You swear to live up to your obligations as a Freemason, and that essentially is initiation, right? As you're saying, it's about acting on those obligations. Many of them which come from nature with a capital N. But so perhaps we can look at maybe initiation in this sense, which we're kind of doing, but maybe skirting around.
Sure.
How would somebody be initiated? Not necessarily formally, although if you want to speak about that's good too. But what is initiation, and how can somebody go about it within or without a particular school, let's say?
Oh, it's extremely difficult. And the reasons are such that you have different levels of initiation or styles of it. And initiation, means to begin something new, essentially, to be entered into something fresh, to initiate, to start. Um, so as you're entered into this new path, this new journey, there are several ways to do it. We think of formal initiation in terms of ritual initiation,
Yeah.
and that's very good. However, ritual initiation from an esoteric perspective, and that's important to make that difference, where the energetic nature and consciousness of the individual is changed, can only occur if those people performing the initiation are at least temporarily in a greater, more heightened and focused state of awareness themselves.
Yeah.
So there you have that issue to address.
Yeah.
This is why many people then talk about self-initiation.
Yeah.
But again, all initiation is self-initiation because you must make the effort and
Right.
be open and receptive to it. That's important too. However, self-initiation requires, just like any self-study or self-solo practice, a tremendous amount of personal dedication and rigor. Now, again, not neurotic, but patient, 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 dedicated every day, staying, doing something, paying careful attention. See, this is what happens: is the average person does not pay attention. The adept or student in training is told to pay attention. Notice what is going on around you.
Yeah.
Notice what is going on within you.
Mm.
Notice your responses. You must have a greater sense of attention. Now, what the teacher does is the teacher grabs you by the nose and holds your nose to it to show you where you're not paying attention.
Right. Yeah. Hmm.
So if you don't have a teacher to help, gently or less gently, pull you back to where you need to pay attention, you have to do it yourself. And that requires a great deal of self-discipline and self-honesty.
Yes.
So there you have some issues as well. You have many people, even when they're involved with good groups, leave because, oh, I didn't like the teacher. Well, what you didn't like is maybe you had a really good teacher, but they held your nose to it, and you didn't like finding out, what your real problems are.
Yeah, for sure.
So there you have issues as well. But the thing about initiation is, initiation really, in a sense, almost by necessity, is going to be terrifying. Because on some level, even if only briefly, you're going to be pushed beyond your comfort zone.
Yes.
And there will be a tremendous terror. That's why, you see, particularly in the late 19th century, I think it was Bulwer Lytton who came up with it, but it could have been someone else, could have been Levy or someone, the notion of the terror of the threshold.
Yeah.
Where you're approaching something, you're just about to cross over, and you're gripped by this tremendous terror. What is that? Confronting that terror of the threshold repeatedly and repeatedly is the confrontation, the looking into the magic mirror of your own mind and seeing and experiencing directly the totality of your being to date, the sum of your experience. We can call that karma. I don't like that word. We can call that, your subconscious, whatever, but it is a summation of what you really are, not what you think you are.
Yes.
And that is what you must address in order to formulate a new concept of self. I have to admit to myself that I am lazy and slothful, and that is why I am experiencing the things that I'm experiencing, and I am not going to do it anymore, and this is what I'm going to do instead. And that's how people are successful in the world.
Yeah.
And what too many occultists do is they make excuses for the failure of their magic to move them ahead in the world. They say, well, magic doesn't do that. Magic isn't about the world. Actually, magic is about nothing but the world. Mysticism is about flights of fancy and ecstatic states and visionary experiences. But the old grimoires are about keeping the cows from dying, healing diseases, keeping the enemy away. Again, the modern systems are confused about even what they're supposed to be doing. Again, we cannot make excuses for our failures. We must stop that individually, but then even within our groups and orders and collectively. We must require more of ourselves so that we can become more than we are right now. If we're to become more than human, I think as it says within the Golden Dawn rituals, well then you do that by taking responsibility for your life.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, absolutely. You have studied and practiced alchemy for a long time, and I think everyone knows at least that there's some kind of transformation, either with metals or herbs or the physical body or the mind. But sticking with the human condition, are there certain practices that you would recommend or find to be essential in transformation besides paying attention and being honest with oneself and determining to sort of change oneself for the better?
Well, those are foundational because if you're not
Yeah.
paying attention and being honest, you're not going anywhere.
Right.
And that's where alchemy, Jean Dubuis used to say about alchemy, it was the only practice that was honest. There was no deception because either you transformed something or you didn't.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone, please, it's so easy. I encourage you all to at least make some basic spagyric tinctures and become familiar with the basic spagyric practices. It's very beneficial. It's very good for cleaning out the psychic channels. Uh, it's a wonderful thing to do. It helps you understand planetary energies, the relationships to your physical body, and it's just something that everyone can benefit from. So
Mm.
it doesn't take a lot of time or effort. It's not like mineral work where it's very, very dangerous or could be very expensive. Please just take the time to spend some time with basic spagyrics. Uh, that being said, we also understand, as Paracelsus said, we only transmute without that which we have first transmuted within. And that transformation or transmutation within first takes place on the level of the mind. We conceive it as a possibility. Then we ponder it to the point where we actually begin to emotionally connect with it, not just as a possibility, but something that we can and will achieve. And when that emotional connectivity kicks in, that's when we begin to see the actual transformation both in our physical bodies and in our environment,
Mm.
and meaning our lives. So these things go deep within us and exist on all these levels. And it's too easy to get trapped in the mind, trapped in ideas because it's easy and it's lazy, and ignore the emotional component, which is the real energy, and then, of course, the physical component, which is the work complete. Like it says in the Corpus Hermeticum, it will ascend and descend, but the work is complete when, of course, above and below are united in the
Yeah.
work of the earth. So in that earth, that expression, I've written 20 books. That didn't happen because I thought about them. That happened because I thought about them, I pondered it, I let it gel, I let it gestate, and then I sat down and put my fingers to the keyboards and pen and pencil to paper, and I did it.
Yeah.
I was honest about what I wrote when it was crap, and I rewrote it.
Yeah, and I know how hard that is, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is, as you say, just doing the work and yeah, and being honest about what it is you're saying and doing, which is hard, as we all know.
That's why it's called the great work.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
I have one fellow who he told me what his goal was. He said, "Look, I'm 42. I weigh 140 pounds. My goal is when my birthday comes around, early next year, to lift twice my body weight." So he wants to lift 280 pounds.
Yeah.
He's currently at 265 pounds. So he's got 15 more to go. Well, as you know, anyone who's been involved in that kind of activity knows that, that last few pounds,
Yeah.
that goes on incrementally. That's a lot of work. And I
Hmm.
explained to him, I said, 20 years ago, had you mentioned that to me, I would have said, well, that's an admirable goal, but not necessarily what we would think of as a spiritual one.
Yeah.
Now I would look at you and say, that is a profound spiritual practice.
Right, exactly. It is, yeah.
So often we have to, turn around and look at what is the real results of what we apply our mind and emotions to. What are the results we're getting from it in the real world?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, that's why I actually recommend some kind of physical training as well, because so many people in the spiritual world, and I'm sure I was like this at one point in my life, that it really becomes this sort of feeling good and theories, and that's all fine, but when you really are pushing your body beyond its limits, then you kind of find out who you really are, and you also, I think, are in contact much more with the universe than just by thinking about things.
Oh, sure. Very much so. And, it doesn't have to be this notion of it having to be yoga, like it has to be yoga or something like that.
No, no,
Any
not at all.
physical activity, because the exhaustion of the body also leads to an exhaustion of the mind. And that exhaustion of the mind is what many spiritual practices are all about. It's in that literal exhaustion of the mind that the awareness or the aha or the insights can take place.
Yeah, 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 and also as well, the sort of overcoming of pain and pushing beyond pain, which is not the sort of pain you're going to die from, obviously, but we all know how difficult and mentally challenging that can be. So,
Well, very much so. Why do you think we look in these movies recently? Why there's this obsession, at least in the United States. I don't know how it is where you are, but there's an obsession in the U.S. with, the Greatest Generation, World War II.
yeah, well, I'm also in the US, but
Well, you see that, and that's because what we're focusing on, if you notice in the movies, is those individuals who overcame, extreme hardship.
yeah,
It's not like the war movies of the past where it's even just the unit or overcoming, overwhelming odds. But now we're seeing a movement towards the story of the individual within the conflict who overcomes extreme physical suffering and emotional suffering and hardship. And that's because, we talk a lot about, at least in Western magic, the Golden Dawn systems and those related to it, knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel.
yeah,
Well, that's very nice. But if you notice, that is a somewhat passive state. Now, this is very good because, again, we need to understand our own mind and be open to those insights that come to it. But it's only at that level of Geburah, at Adeptus Major, that you begin to actively use what you've learned. And where do you actively use it? Well, you actively use it in the world.
right.
What good is a talisman if it doesn't change something in Malkuth, in Isaiah?
Yeah,
Why even make it then? It has no
yeah,
purpose.
right, right, right. And obviously, you've been involved with orders like the Golden Dawn and Martinism and Rosicrucianism. I mean, many of these groups are quite questionable. I mean, not the ones you've been involved with, but in general, I mean, I come
Yes.
come across a lot of groups that I personally would not really want to be involved with. But so what do you think if somebody is out there thinking, I don't want to be involved in these groups because the ones I'm in contact with are kind of flaky and I want to do something by myself? What would be a good start for them, or a good program for them, do you think?
Well, of course, we always encourage everyone to, go to YouTube and, listen to the audio programs that we have on there on the Institute for
Mm,
Hermetic Studies channel. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of good information there. And don't just listen, study it, take notes. Too often people don't do that. They don't study. They just
right.
kind of listen passively. You have to write this stuff down, take notes.
Mm,
Go to Amazon, look up our monograph series, look up the, Words of My Teacher, the supporting book. It's almost 500 pages that goes with that audio program series to
mm,
date. Get that, use it, do the stuff that's in there. Um, it's a very good direction for you. It'll give you a very, very, it won't just give you a solid foundation. It'll give you a solid foundation, first and second floor. I mean, there's stuff in those
mm.
programs that uh, you would have to wait anywhere from 5 to 10 years to get in many groups, if not longer. I mean, some of the stuff we talked about in Child of the Sun, geez, that wasn't that wasn't given out till like 10 and 12, 15 years in, if some of them, if ever.
Yeah.
Same thing with Between the Gates. the most important practice you can do is those dream practices in the body of light, because that's what you're going to need when you die.
On that note, what is the relationship between, say, death and initiation? I mean, I think I don't know what a lot of orders think today, but it would seem to be that a more traditional view is that you're essentially creating a body that can live through death. Obviously, it's not the physical body that we have now, but what do you think?
Well, that is it. I mean, it's essentially maintaining consciousness,
Right.
maintaining continuity of awareness.
Yeah.
And then with that continuity of awareness, if it is strong enough, it creates a form. And that created form is what we call the body of light, or what you see in the East, the rainbow body.
Yeah.
I mean, that is essentially an etheric body that survives the process of dissolution because of the mind of the individual is clear enough. When I say strong, I mean clear, unwavering, unequivocal, without fear or concern. Okay, so that it holds on to that means of, we'll say, interaction, communication, or can create it at will. So that's why understanding one's own mind and one's self-concept is so critical, and why the body of light is so important, particularly in dealing with that process of death.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed.
Most modern groups are completely oblivious to this. They're too busy, I have to say, they're just too busy getting really obsessive about, pentagrams and hexagrams or septagrams and what is the proper color of your Enochian charts.
Right.
Or, oh, we're doing it super old school. Well, super old school is fine too, but what are the results that you're getting out of it?
Yeah.
And are they really doing it old school, or are they just, again, they have access to the grimoires. We have a tremendous amount of material available to us. But what will this do for you, when you're dying? What will this do for you if you believe in some kind of future life or reincarnation or something like that? That's the big question.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thanks for joining us. It's been great to speak to you. Perhaps you could just let people know again where they can find your books and where they can find out about the Institute and anything else you might think relevant.
Institute for Hermetic Studies we have the YouTube channel. You can Google us. You can Google my name, Mark Stavish. You can go to Amazon and find a complete list of our publications and monographs, the IHS monograph series. We have a blog, a weekly blog known as Vox Hermes. You can subscribe to that at WordPress. And of course, just Google my name. A lot of stuff will come up, including an email address, info@hermeticinstitute.org. And we'll get you set up with whatever information you need.
Great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.